The 29th of December 1981. At 7:15 p.m, Trevor Shaw was driving down the Port Arlington to Monasterevin Road with his girlfriend and parents. As he came to Coolnaferry Bog, he saw lights up ahead. When he got closer, he saw it was a car that had gone into the ditch. He got out, went over to the driver's side. The driver's side window was smashed, and he could see a woman laying across the front seat of the car. There was blood on her hands and her hair was matted. At this time, another driver came along the other way, Paul Toomey, and he knew first aid. So he actually checked to see if he could feel a pulse on the woman. He couldn't. It was agreed then that Trevor would go off to Monasterevin to notify the Gardaí. At around 7:35 p.m, Garda Pat Ryan arrived on the scene. He immediately recognised the woman in the Datsun car as H.H Holmes, the wife of his friend Harry. He noted she was missing a shoe. He went back up onto the road to look to see if there was any signs of where the car had veered off. But he couldn't. There were no skid marks, nothing. Her body would be taken to Portlaoise General Hospital. Close to 9 p.m, Sergeant Chris O'Halloran and Father Dennis O'Sullivan arrived at Semlo Knitwear Factory. This was Henry Holmes' business. Harry went by Henry, and Henry was inside dealing with a customer, a couple who had actually come from Galway, Mr. and Mrs. Conair, and he was filling an order for them. And when he saw the sergeant and the priest, he knew it wasn't good news. They went into the canteen, asked him to sit down, and he said, "Is it my father?" And they said, "No, it's Anne." Henry lurched forward and Sergeant O'Halloran caught him. He immediately started crying. They told him that her car had been found crashed on the Old Bog Road. They asked him did he know this road, and he said no, although it wasn't that far from their home. They asked if he wanted to go see her body. He said no, he couldn't stand the sight of blood. When our story takes place, Henry and Anne Holmes were both in their late 30s and from Monasterevin. In the early 80s, this was quite a small area in Kildare. After finishing school, Henry went on to work at Tyne Knitwear Factory, and immediately he was seen as someone who was eager and had a lot of potential, and he was quickly promoted. He would go on to become a works engineer, and he would even be sent to places like Britain and Germany to gain more experience and to learn more skills. He met Anne Melia one day after Mass. She was also from the area, and for a bit she also worked at Tyne Knitwear Factory, and then she went on to get a sales assistant job somewhere else. They married on the 3rd of August in 1967. They were both just coming up to 23. Their first daughter was born the following year in 1968, Sharon. Russell Anthony would come along in 1970, and 4 years later, Julia. It was common when you got married at the time to leave work, stay at home and stuff. Actually, like for the public service jobs, you had to. There was no choice. You had to give up your job. But after a couple of years, Anne was eager to get back to the workplace. And so, with Henry's help, she actually set up a little boutique in the local shopping centre called Anne's Boutique. Obviously, then they were able to use Henry's, connections and stuff like this. Henry would also go on to set up his own garment making side business. Shortly after this, his mother would die. And the following year, he was made redundant. This, however, gave him that push that he needed to make his side business his full-time passion. And so he rented a small premises in Ballybridis, which is in County Laois, 10 minutes from their home. The following year, he built his own premises near to this current one. He would call it Semlo Knitwear, so this was basically Holmes backwards. And the following year, he created Semlo Export, so obviously, exporting the goods and stuff like that. And when our story takes place in 81, he has 30 employees working for him. The Holmes were very religious, like a lot of people at the time. So obviously they went to mass, but they were quite devout, they were quite religious, and that would come into our story later. The family lived in a beautiful home called H.H House. So Holmes was quite successful, and his side passion was fast cars. So his money allowed him to do this. So he actually raced, on an amateur level, and bought nice cars. In December 1981, Anne Holmes is 6 months pregnant with the couple's 4th child. Their eldest is away at boarding school, and then so the 2 younger ones are still at home with them. After leaving the factory, Henry and the priest went to the scene of the accident to see the car. And then he went to his mother-in-law's house, Kathleen Melia, who by chance actually had their kids overnight. He hugged her and then began crying, saying she's gone. He got home then at around 10:30 p.m. And shortly after this, Garda Pat Ryan would arrive. As I said, they were friends. He arrived to say how sorry he was, give his condolences, and Henry asked him to stay for a while, to talk and stuff. So he did, and he stayed and he listened to Henry talk about, them as a couple, when they met, having their children, their life together, all of this. And by 6:30 a.m, he was still there. And at this point, he said that maybe they should go for a walk. So they went for a little walk up and down the road and stuff. And then when they got back to the house at around 7:45, Pat Ryan left. When it came to the scene of the accident, it started to become apparent that it might not have been an accident. The car was at a right angle, so normally if a car was to veer off, it would usually kind of be more of a wonky angle, whereas this car was purely in like this, which would suggest that someone actually had turned the wheel all the way to push it in. The engine was still running, even though, if it had been a crash. The fact that the driver's window was fully smashed in, and this, didn't really correspond, I suppose, to where her body was. Even the fact that, her shoe was missing. The assistant state pathologist, Dr. Declan Gilsenan, would go to Portlaoise General Hospital to examine Anne's body. And he would note that there was a compound fracture to the right side of Anne's head. He then went to the scene of the accident and to check, because he was like, there's nothing in the car, in a car crash, that could have done that. And he went again and examined and was certain there was nothing that could have caused that fracture. At this point, it was determined it was not a traffic accident and a murder investigation was opened. As you can imagine, the Holmes residence then was just full of people, coming over to visit to pay their condolences, family, friends, neighbours. Someone from the An Garda Síochána told Holmes that they were investigating his wife's death as either a murder or a suicide. And Henry would go on to say, for the kids' sake, he hoped it wasn't a suicide. In the afternoon, then on the 30th, his sister Louise and her husband Michael Mahon would come over like that to pay their condolences and stuff, to see what he needed. And they went upstairs to talk. Obviously, maybe to just get away from, the noise, the hustle and bustle. So upstairs, they're talking, and Henry mentions, would she have left a note or something? So he seems to be on the idea that it was a suicide. And when they were leaving to go back downstairs, Louise or her husband noted that there was a big pile of washing, so they suggested, why don't I take that, and I'll bring it home, I'll wash it and stuff, it's one less thing you need to be worrying about right now. And so Henry thanked them and said, yeah, but said you don't need to wash them if you can just keep them in your utility room for now. An incident room was set up in Kildare Garda Station, and Sergeant Tom Connolly and Jerry O'Connell would come down from Dublin. So they were part of what we remember as the murder squad. Superintendent John Courtney would also say in his book that he went, although I don't see him mentioned anywhere else. And some of his sources, when I say that there are different sources, it seems to be his book that kind of says a few things are different than what the other sources are telling me. At 2 p.m, Sergeant O'Halloran and Sergeant O'Connell go to H.H House. When O'Halloran introduced him to the Dublin detective, Holmes started crying. So the sergeant puts his hand around him, guides him over to the couch, and they all sit down for a chat. And they basically just say, we need to get your formal statement of, when you last saw your wife, what you were doing, the day of the incident. He spoke to them about his family, his work, everything, and said that they had a generally happy life together. He did, however, say that Anne suffered from depression. The first pregnancy had been quite tough on her, and, she wasn't really the same after that. I suppose then obviously there is a risk with every pregnancy after that. Antenatal depression or whatever returning, postnatal depression returning, stuff like that. So by this fourth one, he would say that she had been taking up to 3 Valium a day and that she stopped the previous year. And that when she got pregnant with the 4th child, it was becoming tough again, but she didn't want to go back on the tablets. He would also mention that she had varicose veins that she was quite upset about or paranoid about. He said their Christmas Day was normal, but that on the 26th there was an incident with Anne's uncle. So he suffered from psychiatric issues and he was actually brought to Carlow Psychiatric Hospital. And then the day that Anne died, the 29th, so he said that he left at around 11 a.m. to go to the factory, but that he was back by about noon and Anne was making dinner. The 2 of them and the 2 younger children had dinner, and then the 2 younger children asked to be brought to their grandmothers to stay the night. So Henry brought them to Kathleen's, and then he stayed there for a while talking to her. He says that when he got back, Anne was like, snuggled up on the couch watching a film on RTE starring Charlton Heston. He said that he then, sat with her for a while and watched, but that he had things to do, so he got up. And one of the things he needed to do was lay like linoleum. He also says marley floor. So he started cutting and measuring and all of this to put it down on the floor in the hallway. He said Anne's aunt called to use the phone. So obviously at the time, not everybody had phones. So her aunt called to use their phone. Now, Henry would say that Anne didn't want to be disturbed, so that he had to let on, that she wasn't there. So after the aunt left, Henry left to go for a walk. And he would say that a comment was made by Anne to say that he was always working. He said when he got back, he just got straight into his car because he had an appointment at the factory. So he says when he got back, he didn't notice that his wife's car was there, and he can't remember if there was lights on in the house or not. By the time he got to his factory, it was 7:30 p.m. and Mrs. Conair was there, but Mr. Conair had actually gone off to try get a phone to reach Henry, because Henry was half an hour late for this appointment. They were supposed to have it 7. He then went off to look for Mr. Conair and couldn't find him, so he went back, and so by the time he went back, Mr. Conair was back. And so they went in and had their appointment, and then like that, Sergeant O'Halloran arrived then around 9 p.m. He said that he couldn't think of any reason why someone would want to harm his wife. She didn't have enemies or anything like that. He also says that when he did arrive home the night before, the house was not disturbed or anything. They would ask, could they preserve the scene to, examine it? Henry said, yeah, no problem, obviously. So they really didn't think things were adding up. Now, they'd done the usual. They'd done door-to-door inquiries with questionnaires and stuff, but they wanted to use Pat Ryan's friendship with Henry to their advantage. And so at around 9 p.m. that night, Pat Ryan arrived over. Now, I don't know, did they get him to do this or if he just arrived over anyway? But they were chatting, and he also asked, where he had been that day before his wife died. He would tell him that like that at around 5:15 p.m. he went out jogging. He went up St. Evans Park onto Tyne and Knitwear Factory and then came back. And he would say he immediately got back into his car to go meet the Conairs at 7 p.m. So in the Mahon's house, so Louise and Michael noted that there was a brown anorak in the pile of clothes that they had taken. And so he lifted it just to kind of examine it because he thought it looked a bit weird, and he noticed that there were stains on it and they looked like blood. He would show this to his wife, and his wife agreed that they should call the Gardaí, which is an interesting take. Some people I don't think would go that route. I think they'd be like, I'll call my brother. So they called the Garda station and asked to speak to Pat Ryan. And so Pat Ryan arrives at their house, sees the anorak, takes the anorak and brings it back to the incident room. When the Gardaí examined the house, they were trying for fingerprints, hoping to see like that, could they find different fingerprints or whatever, or I suppose also then to rule out foreign fingerprints. In the kitchen, they found blood spatter by the radiator behind it, also on the door. And the blood spatter was directional, which meant it was already coming from an already bleeding wound. Now, there was no DNA at the time in Ireland, so this would only be able to do they'd be able to do the blood group to see if it was Anne Holmes' blood group. That's as close as they could get. Now, this is one of the things where the sources differ. So the main source that I use has that there was a bloody lump hammer in the car with Anne. And then another source says that it was in another car at their home, which you would have to assume was Henry Holmes' car. Funerals in Ireland happen really quick. They happen so quick, they actually, you get very little time to grieve before the funeral is even over. But I think back then they were even really quick, like the next day quick, because it seems like on New Year's Eve, Anne Holmes' body was removed to St. Peter and Paul's Church in Monasterevin. And so after the service at about 8:30, Henry was walking out of the church with a friend called Noel Kelly, and they saw Pat Ryan. So the three of them got into Noel Kelly's car to talk. And then Pat Ryan said that the Gardaí wanted to speak to Henry. And he said, why? I already spoke to them. And Pat said, I don't know. So he was driven to the Garda station. And when he got there, he went into an interview room with the two Dublin detectives, Connolly and O'Carroll. They thanked Henry for coming. They told him he was free to leave at any time, but then they cautioned him and told him that they believed he was responsible for his wife's death. Just getting straight to the point. Henry Holmes would just calmly deny this. They told him about the bloody anorak, about the blood they found in the kitchen. He was quite cool and calm, and then, they were obviously at him or whatever, and then Connolly said to him, you need to come clean. And at this point, he just lost his composure and started crying. And he said, "What about my children? What will become of my children? They're all I care about. I'm here because of my temper." He started sobbing and then said, "What's the sentence for murder?" "There is only one sentence for murder, and that is life imprisonment," Connolly said. "What's the sentence for manslaughter?" "That is entirely a matter for the court." At that point, he said that he would take full responsibility, but that he wanted to speak to Pat Ryan. When Pat joined, he gave another statement under caution. He would say that after the aunt left, he went back to cutting the lino, and that he mismeasured and cut it too short for one side. He would say that Anne came out and said, "You've made a bags of that. You never get anything right." He said that she then made a comment about his mother. An argument began and it moved to the kitchen, and he said that Anne then slapped him and that it stung. And he had the lump hammer in his hand, and he swung and hit her on the right side of her head. He said she turned and started to walk off, and that he hit her 2 more times. She fell, obviously it was blood, and he says, as he did earlier, he can't stand the sight of blood, and so he fainted. He says that when he awoke, he said a contrition in her ear. He said then that he panicked, put her into the car with the intention of getting to the hospital or to a doctor, but that the car stalled when they were on the Coolnaferra road, and that he could see a car coming towards him, and he panicked. And so he got out and he turned the wheel and he pushed it into the ditch. And then he walked home. He changed clothes and left them upstairs, and then he cleaned the kitchen. And then he went and met Mr. and Mr. Conair, and this was why he was late. When the statement was read back to Henry, he said to them, "You left out the part where I said a contrition in her ear." So they amended it and he signed it. They asked about the missing shoe, and he said it must have come off when I was, pulling her or lifting her or whatever. And Gardaí did go back and find the shoe. They also asked if he would give a blood sample to, rule him out for the blood that they found. And he said, "No, there's no need. I can tell you it was Anne's." So in the early hours of New Year's Day, a special court sitting was held at the Garda station, and Henry Holmes was charged with the murder of Anne Holmes, his wife. He was driven up to Dublin to Mountjoy prison. His friend Noel and his brother-in-law Michael met him there, and they assured him that they would make sure the kids were looking after, and they would try their best to look after his business. He was booked into Mountjoy jail at 4:30 a.m. The funeral was that following morning, and he did not ask to be released to go. General consensus here would be that it was a manslaughter. It was done out of provocation. He didn't mean it. Then, in January, obviously when news broke that he had been arrested and charged, people came forward. But just one point first. They had a phone, and obviously they were one of the few people who had a phone because her aunt had to come over to use it. Why didn't he call an ambulance? Why didn't he call a doctor? And one source even says, why didn't he call a priest? He knew how religious and devoted his wife was, and he would have known that she wanted to have the last rites read to her. Who in their right minds puts the person into the car? In January 1981, Ivan Poynton quit the garment business and went into selling insurance. And he used his connections to try drum up business. And so he touched base with Henry Holmes. And at the time, Henry said, he was interested in insurance for himself. But when Ivan found out that he, was into the fast cars and stuff, he said this would complicate things. And so Henry just kind of stopped returning his calls then, for whatever reason. Ivan did follow up a few times and nothing, so obviously he just wasn't interested in the insurance policy anymore. On the 30th of November 1981, Henry got in touch with Ivan and that he wanted to get life insurance for his wife, Anne. Now, Anne knew about this. This wasn't kind of like a secret one where you forge it or something. She knew about it. The only concern she had was that she needed to get a medical, and because she was pregnant, she was afraid, it might be a bit too much. And Ivan assured her that she could just go to her own doctor for this. So Henry Holmes insured his wife for 100 grand. 125 if it was an accident. On the 22nd of December 1981, it became official. And a week later, Anne will be dead. The day before Anne died, on the 28th of December, her brother, Patrick Melia, and his wife Rose were down from Dublin to visit Rose's parents. And so they called in to the Holmes residence. They said Anne was in great humour, serving tea and sandwiches and all chats. Patrick would comment that Henry was quite cool with him, and that he actually kind of kept leaving for different reasons. At one point he actually left to go to the factory, and so Patrick went with him, to see him. And he would say that on the way back they went by the Port Arlington to Monasterevin Road and passed Coolnafarrig Bog. And he would say that in all the times he had gone with Henry to his factory, they had never come back this way. They had never used that road before. And he said it was like Henry couldn't even hear him when he was talking. He was in a daze. And the last interesting person to come forward was 20-year-old Anne Raleigh. She was from Port Arlington and had worked in Semlo knitwear since she was 16. And at the end of October, early November, when Anne was away at Lourdes, Henry asked the 20-year-old out to dinner. He would go on to tell her that the marriage was unhappy, that it was basically finished, that once his wife had had the baby, she was going to emigrate to Australia. He told her she was the first, woman that he had been talking to and brought out to dinner and stuff like that. He would call her at her family home. They would go out to the Curragh and just sit and chat. They would go back to the factory after everybody had left. They bought each other Christmas gifts. And there was no evidence to suggest that Anne ever knew about this. Although Henry did say the comment that she said he was always at the factory, so unless she was trying to imply something, but there's nothing to say that she knew. After Anne died, Henry's mistress would come to the house to pay her condolences. And a few days into the new year, she would confess to her brother about the affair, and he advised her to go to the Gardaí. And she said, "I am still in love with him, but I would find it difficult to go out with him again." Henry Holmes was granted bail in the second week of January, so he had to put up £5,000 himself and then an independent surety of £5,000. The trial would begin on the 10th of March 1983. The jury was 11 men and 1 woman, which I thought was quite unusual. I don't think I've ever come across a case where there was that many men and only 1 woman. Henry Holmes would plead not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter. The state pathologist, Professor John Harbison, would give evidence about the post-mortem. He would say that there was 10 blows to the right side of Anne's head. He would also say that there was marks and bruising on her neck, which would suggest that she was also strangled. She had a pronounced bruise on her eye to indicate a punch, and her cause of death was hemorrhaging as a result of compressed fracture of the skull. Another witness, John Daly, he was like a public service vehicle inspector, and so he gave evidence about issues with the car. He said for the crash or whatever, there was superficial damage, but there was something up with like the spring to do with the accelerator. And I am not good at cars, so I'm going to read this bit out for you. So, the accelerator pedal. When the pedal was depressed and pressure released, the pedal did not return in the usual manner. I found the spring attached to the pedal, which returns the pedal when pressure is released, was disconnected. With this out of place, it meant that the pedal remained in whatever position it had been put into. The accelerator release spring is made from strong steel and clips into a tiny hole in the bracket. It would take substantial pressure to open. I am satisfied it would not open under normal pressure. So basically it was concluding that someone took this out after the car had been pushed into the ditch. Anne Raleigh would give evidence. The week before Christmas, they found themselves alone in the storeroom of the factory. And the prosecution, Geraghty, would say, "What happened in the storeroom? Do I have to answer that? I'm afraid you do. We got carried away. We were both lonely. We went further than we should have." So obviously at this point, that was the first time that they had actually consummated the affair. Ivan Poynton would also be a witness, as well as Gardaí. Family members from both sides would also testify. Kathleen Melia, his mother-in-law, when asked about his temper, said, "I knew he had a bad temper. He'd knock the kids on the head and face. He'd hit them for not doing their homework. He'd use his fist. That was the only violence I saw." She said she saw her daughter and son-in-law practically every day and never thought there was anything wrong, didn't see him ever be violent towards Anne, and that she had a good relationship with him. Now, Henry's sister Louise would say that in the time leading up to this, she did notice a deterioration in the marriage and that she would see Anne like nagging him and stuff. On the 4th day of the trial, Henry Holmes testified. He said when Anne hit him, "It was a stinging blow. It stung me. The surge came through me. I could not believe it. She had never raised a hand to me before." The first thing I remember is Anne lying on the ground. I saw the blood and passed out. When I picked myself up, I said, "Oh God, what have I done?" I started to sweat. I spoke to Anne and I said an act of contrition in her ear. I think I was still talking to Anne, trying to get her to talk back, when I thought about going for a doctor or to a hospital. I grabbed my coat and put it over her. He would admit that Anne Raleigh was his third marital affair in the 18 months leading up to 1981 Christmas time. He said that Anne complained a lot, that she wanted, she wanted this, she wanted that, and that he would always give her what she wanted, that she wanted a new kitchen, it cost £5,000. And then she complained while, the work was being done, so he sent her on a holiday. He was short, I suppose you would say, for a man. He was 5'4", and he said that whenever, Anne wanted to get at him, she would comment on this. He would also say that when he went to meet the Canaires, he had taken one of Anne's volumes. The trial lasted 6 days, and then the jury basically had to decide if he was guilty of manslaughter or was he guilty of murder. Was there an intent to kill? And so the jury went out, and after 2 hours of deliberating, they came back with a query for the judge. And another 2 hours later, they came back and said that they were unable to find a verdict. So they were dismissed. His defence counsel would ask that he would be put on bail again, because of the business and the kids and all this. However, the judge said no, because he might not have been found guilty of either, but he pled guilty to manslaughter, and so he couldn't let him go. However, it wasn't long until the second trial, and this started on the 12th of April. And at this one, the jury deliberated for 10 hours, and then they found him not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. He was held in Mountjoy until sentencing. On Thursday, the 21st of April, Brian McCaffrey, who was the clinical director of psychiatry with the Eastern Health Board, visited him in Mountjoy. Now, I'm going to read a bit out, but I kind of feel like I think counselling and therapy and all that is great if you want it to work, and I feel like if you're the type who didn't want it to work, you just say what you want to say for people to believe what you want them to believe. Right? I mean, that's a nutshell of what I think. But anyway, so this guy is now going to give an opinion, a psychiatric opinion on Anne from the words of her husband. The psychiatrist said it was his impression that Anne Holmes had suffered from a psychiatric illness. He gained the impression that from an early stage in the marriage, Holmes' wife was constantly nagging. She did not support him emotionally and showed no interest in his business. Henry Holmes was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He got out then in the 90s, obviously, after he served the sentence, and moved back to Monasterevin. Tragically, his son, Russell Anthony, who was 11 when his mother died, would die in a road traffic accident. I put him to be in his early 20s when this happened, maybe late teens. Henry then went on to remarry and now lives in Laois. Hi guys, so that is the tragic case of Anne Holmes and her scumbag husband. Let me know what you think. Do you think that he planned it more? I would lean towards planning it, but I think at this point I'm just very negative, and I think that about everybody. I don't deny that maybe something had happened, but I feel like there was too many little tidbits for it to have been maybe something that was planned. Anyway, I'm not going to rant. Thank you for all the support, and we shall see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.